Diversity is a part of our values, and we are committed to having diverse interviewers, diversity of languages into which we translate surveys and data, and of course, ensuring that we cover as many countries as we can in our diverse continent.
In terms of diversity and inclusivity, Afrobarometer makes a deliberate policy that requires all our national partners to make sure that at least 40% of their field workers are women. And in some cases, actually, we have more than 50% of the field workers that are women. In terms of our samples, again, Afrobarometer has a deliberate policy that 50% of our samples will be women and 50% will be men. And in terms of coverage, national coverage, because the samples are nationally representative, so it means that in each country the sample is distributed based on the population that is in rural or urban areas in proportion to the population.
My name is Seth Matijau. I am the Executive Director, Center for Research and Policy Development. They have been the National Investigator for Afrobarometer in the Gambia since 2018. I think since we started AB in 2018, I think one of the challenges we faced was the issue of language, where the further you go, people were not willing to talk to you if you were not able to speak their language. With round 8 and round 9, we were able to overcome that challenge because people got to know exactly what Afrobarometer was. But I think our proudest moment has been when I saw Afrobarometer being cited by the government in the National Development Plan.
Também o governo apresenta os dados da Afrobarometer. A mídia, de uma forma geral, também apresenta os dados da Afrobarometer, e há uma frase extremamente interessante que as pessoas utilizam, é Afrobarometer disse, ou seja, aquilo que o Afrobarometer diz corresponde à verdade. Portanto,
Across the 39 countries, we have a continental data set, and this data set is now shared with the continental decision makers.
We also have piloted surveys using telephone in Botswana, Zambia, and also Burkina Faso. So those are really major, and we are in the process of actually being able to, build protocols on how survey can be done in Africa. Using telephone.
Le moment dont je suis le plus fier, c'est toujours celui du débriefing avec les équipes et de voir que tous les agents qui vont sur le terrain, ils viennent toujours transformer avec une nouvelle connaissance et une nouvelle vision de leur pays.
When I look into the future, I pray, whether I'm still there or not, that, Afrobarometer, everywhere you turn, people are referencing Afrobarometer's data, before they take decisions. So the decisions that people make are more qualitative, more accurate, and more impactful. And I think that's really what it's about.
Completing the Round 9 survey has been a journey filled with hard work, determination, and success. As we bid farewell to this chapter, we look forward to new horizons, new projects, and new challenges. Our journey continues. Cheers to the future. Welcome to a journey of voices, data and progress as we mark the conclusion of Afrobarometer's Round 9 survey. It was an incredible adventure, a journey that began in 2021 with dedicated enumerators working tirelessly in diverse terrains across 39 African countries. These unsung heroes are the backbone of Afrobarometer's mission, laying the foundation for around 9 surveys.
Afrobarometer has been conducting these surveys since 1999, and this was the 9th iteration of the surveys. And it is part of our mission to make sure that citizen voice is part of public discourse. For the first time, we're able to cover up to 39 countries on the continent since we started these surveys in 1999, so that was a big highlight. The second is that within a calendar year, 12 months, we were able to complete more than 30 surveys. This was also a record for us because we've never been able to complete up to 30 surveys in one calendar year. And our visibility increased several hundred percentage folds.
I don't know if people are aware that our country is called the kingdom in the sky because it's very mountainous, so the terrain is very difficult. But it doesn't matter how far it is, how difficult it is, we always endeavor to get where we are supposed to get. Usually the proudest moment is actually getting the data, getting the results, and getting to share them, to really get the people to know what Basotho think about issues which are very important to them.
Diversity is a part of our values, and we are committed to having diverse interviewers, diversity of languages into which we translate surveys and data, and of course, ensuring that we cover as many countries as we can in our diverse continent.
In terms of diversity and inclusivity, Afrobarometer makes a deliberate policy that requires all our national partners to make sure that at least 40% of their field workers are women. And in some cases, actually, we have more than 50% of the field workers that are women. In terms of our samples, again, Afrobarometer has a deliberate policy that 50% of our samples will be women and 50% will be men. And in terms of coverage, national coverage, because the samples are nationally representative, so it means that in each country the sample is distributed based on the population that is in rural or urban areas in proportion to the population.
My name is Seth Matijau. I am the Executive Director, Center for Research and Policy Development. They have been the National Investigator for Afrobarometer in the Gambia since 2018. I think since we started AB in 2018, I think one of the challenges we faced was the issue of language, where the further you go, people were not willing to talk to you if you were not able to speak their language. With round 8 and round 9, we were able to overcome that challenge because people got to know exactly what Afrobarometer was. But I think our proudest moment has been when I saw Afrobarometer being cited by the government in the National Development Plan.
Também o governo apresenta os dados da Afrobarometer. A mídia, de uma forma geral, também apresenta os dados da Afrobarometer, e há uma frase extremamente interessante que as pessoas utilizam, é Afrobarometer disse, ou seja, aquilo que o Afrobarometer diz corresponde à verdade. Portanto, a credibilidade, o respeito que a Afrobarometer ganhou no seio da sociedade cabo-verdiana, para mim, tanto é a parte mais gratificante do trabalho que nós temos realizado até então.
From the bustling cities to the remote villages, our dedicated team persevered. They overcame hurdles and celebrated victories. Together, we've etched the story of determination and resilience that is evidenced by data that would give people a voice.
So some of the ways that our people made their around 9 surveys a big success and that we achieved records includes the fact that, one, we see ourselves as sharing in the agenda and vision of Afrobarometer. We are all committed to the vision. So we pull the data together across the 39 countries. We have a continental data set, and this data set is now shared with the continental decision makers.
We also have piloted surveys using telephone in Botswana, Zambia, and also Burkina Faso. So those are really major, and we are in the process of actually being able to, build protocols on how survey can be done in Africa using telephone.
Le moment dont je suis le plus fier, c'est toujours celui du débriefing avec les équipes et de voir que tous les agents qui vont sur le terrain, ils viennent toujours transformer avec une nouvelle connaissance et une nouvelle vision de leur pays.
When I look into the future, I pray, whether I'm still there or not, that, Afrobarometer, everywhere you turn, people are referencing Afrobarometer's data, before they take decisions. So the decisions that people make are more qualitative, more accurate, and more impactful. And I think that's really what it's about.
Completing the Round 9 survey has been a journey filled with hard work, determination and success. As we bid farewell to this chapter, we look forward to new horizons, new projects and new challenges. Our journey.
All right. Good morning, everybody, and thank you so much for joining us today. Sorry we've started a little late. I believe we would be able to make up the time. All right, so let me start with just acknowledging our dignitaries here, Excellencies, representatives of the Government of Ghana, Excellencies, ambassadors and members of the Diplomatic Corps, members of the Afrobarometer Governing Board and International Advisory Council, heads and representatives of think tanks, civil society groups from all across the continent, members of the Advisory Board of the Africa Judicial Independence Fund, representatives of the philanthropic community, heads and representatives of Afrobarometer core and national partners, colleagues, friends, and dear ones from the media houses across Ghana, ladies and gentlemen, all protocol observed. It is with great pleasure and honor that I welcome you all to Accra and to the official launch of Afrobarometer's flagship report that focuses on democracy and governance on the continent. This report is the first in a series of reports that we would produce annually on high-impact policy topics on the continent. And as you know, Afrobarometer covers a wide range of topics. The maiden report dedicated to democracy and governance because that is our the core of Afrobarometer's work, looking at how democracy evolves on the continent. And for subsequent years, we'll begin to think about different topics that we will cover going forward. Some of the topics under consideration will be something like climate change, gender and inclusion, and then many others, children and child welfare, and the like. And so we would be releasing a report similar to the one we're releasing today every year around this time of the year. This year is particularly special because Afrobarometer turns 25 since our founding. So on July 5, 1999, the surveys in Ghana kicked off as one of the first countries to be in the field. And then since then, we started with the first round of the surveys in 12 countries and has since grown up to 40 plus countries today. Our hope is that we'll cover up to 42 countries this time around, and the surveys have just kicked off at the moment. 2 weeks ago, exactly on July 5, we launched the Afrobarometer's Founders Day. And for those of you who know, there were 3 co-founders in 1999, Professors Jima Bwadi, Michael Bratton, who are here with us today, and Professor Robert Mattis, who is not here today. We are grateful to all of you joining us today. We extended invitations, and we are happy that you've joined us today. Your presence certainly reflects the extent of commitment and solidarity that we hope to build on the continent in pursuit of our shared goal of making governance and government work for everybody. What started as an academic project in 1999 has morphed into one of the most influential and independent research projects on the continent. At its conception in the late 1990s, the idea of polling African citizens seemed ridiculous. It did not even feel like something that can be done. But of course, due to the perseverance of the 3 co-founders and the resilience of the 12 initial national partners, we pulled it off and proved the critics wrong. Due to the can-do spirit, we continue to grow Afrobarometer across the continent. To let the people have a say which is our tagline, was the driving force behind Afrobarometer's creation 25 years ago. And looking back, there is ample evidence that the network has delivered effectively on the objective. With surveys conducted in 42 countries, the data from Afrobarometer now represents the views of 3/4 of the African population. The volume, quality, variety of the evidence generated and the distribution and use of these insights have expanded enormously during this period, giving voice to ordinary Africans in public policy and decision making, which is the core business of Afrobarometer. Now incorporated as an independent entity in Ghana, Afrobarometer has gained global attention as the go-to source for high-quality data on what Africans are thinking. It is gratifying to witness the consistent and growing use of Afrobarometer data by various actors, including government, civil society actors, the media, students, scholars, all over the globe. Of course, Afrobarometer's data has been used extensively by various governance measures, including the Ibrahim Governance of Index of African Governance, the World Bank Worldwide Governance Indicators, as well as continental projects like the Africa Peer Review Mechanism. And we are proud that we are able to contribute to all of these efforts. Additionally, our methodology for survey research on the continent has become the go-to methodology for researchers on the continent. And this has been one of the biggest contributions of Afrobarometer to survey research on the continent, to understanding the politics and governance and societies and cultures of Africa. We are grateful to the government of Ghana for agreeing to host Afrobarometer here as the headquarters. Okay, from our home base here in Ghana, we hope to be able to contribute to the government of Ghana's efforts to foster regional and continental integration. We are also grateful to the large and growing number of governments on the continent who continue to give us green light to conduct these surveys. Surveys that sometimes ask questions that are critical of government and responses that can be unpalatable to governments. But we feel honored that they continue to allow us to do these surveys because they see value in listening to what their citizens have to say. And we are grateful to the governments who have allowed us to do so much. Our deepest gratitude and respect, of course, goes to our 3 founders who, through their dream, has made this project possible today. The management and staff of our core and national partners, especially the initial 12 countries who started this project off, we are really grateful to you for the resilience and the shared vision you had with the co-founders at the beginning. Many other continental bodies, especially within the African Union, especially the Political Affairs, Peace and Security Department, the African Governance Architecture, the Office of the Youth Ambassador, the Africa Peer Review Mechanism, the Economic, Social, and Cultural Council, ECOSOC, and many others within the African Union have been proven to be excellent collaborators, and we are grateful for that. As we take stock and celebrate our achievements, we must underscore the enormous support of our funding partners who have allowed Afrobarometer to thrive to date. Your continued support and confidence has allowed us to make Afrobarometer data available freely to the world, and that has contributed a lot to informing decisions, and so we are grateful to our funders. Of course, the support has also allowed us to fill a critical gap. Data gaps on the continent is a major issue, but Afrobarometer's data has helped to fill that critical gap of knowing what citizens think, what they prioritize, and what they hope for, and we are grateful to our funders for that. Let me take the opportunity to appeal to those out there who see value in our work and would like to support us. We would warmly welcome you to the fold of our funding partners. Your generous support, of course, will go a long way to amplifying the voices of our ordinary Africans on the continent. I also want to indicate here that we encourage individual donations as well. Individuals, however small the amount is, whether it is $5 or $10, you can donate that on our website in any currency of your choice. It doesn't have to be a US dollar denominated. So we welcome that, and probably next 25 years we'll be celebrating Afrobarometer and recognizing the individuals who have made a contribution to Afrobarometer and allowing it to thrive. And finally, to the staff of Afrobarometer, this all couldn't have been possible without them. The meticulous and resilient surveys team, the methodical and unrelenting analysis and capacity building team, the forward-thinking and responsive members of the publications team, the fast and furious but compassionate communications team, the detail-oriented and patient data team, the diligent, empathetic, and supportive secretariat team. All of these folks are the ones that make Afrobarometer what it is today. I'm really, truly grateful to them. I often say that they make work at where I sit unbearably easy, and so really grateful to them because they carry everything. Thank you so much. I think they deserve that. So it is with great pride that we mark this 25th anniversary by dedicating the first flagship report to examining the trends and evaluations of Africa's democratic experiment. We hope that readers will find the insights presented in this report and, of course, the conversation that will take place here by our panelists compelling and enlightening. So at this point, and with those remarks, I would want to introduce our keynote speaker for today. Our keynote speaker, Dr. Andrew Dalaban, is the Africa Region Chief Economist of the World Bank. He has been in this role since July of 2022. As Chief Economist, he is responsible for providing guidance on strategic priorities and technical quality of economic analysis in the region, as well as developing major regional economic studies, among others. Andrew has held a variety of positions at the bank, including senior economist for the World Bank's Europe and Central Asia region, lead economist and practice manager for poverty and equity in Africa, and most recently, practice manager for poverty and equity in the South Asia region. So he has wide-ranging knowledge of the bank's operations and work. His research and scholarly publications are focused on poverty and social impact, inequality of opportunity, program evaluation, risk and vulnerability, labor markets, and conflict and welfare outcomes. He has co-authored regional reports on equality of opportunity for children in Africa, vulnerability and resilience in the Sahel, and poverty in a rising Africa. A Kenyan national and a Gen Zer in spirit, Andrew holds a master's degree in international development from the University of California at Davis and a PhD in agriculture and resource economics from the University of California at Berkeley. And so with that, please join me in welcoming our keynote speaker, Dr. Andrew Dalaban.
Good morning. Joe was going to get me into trouble when he calls me a Gen Zer in spirit. It's a pleasure to be here. First of all, I mean, with a lot of humility and incredible privilege, I am delighted to be joining the 25th anniversary celebration of. Is this working? Yeah, okay. I do remember, actually, it's interesting because the origins of Afrobarometer and my start at the World Bank almost mirror each other. I joined the World Bank when the Afrobarometer, the first surveys of Afrobarometer actually appeared in the public domain. And at the time, the World Bank was struggling to try to figure out the role of governance in development. And there was a kind of a courageous president who really talked a lot about corruption. And the cancer of corruption in development. And a lot of people in the World Bank at the time, I had just joined, but a lot of people in the bank at the time were kind of uneasy about talking about corruption because it was too political. And the interesting thing is that at the time, some relatively entrepreneurial researchers began to try and build indicators of governance. But they didn't have a lot of data, especially on Africa. And lo and behold, Afrobarometer shows up, and it becomes one of the... Initially, there was a lot of skepticism, but in the end, I think it won over a lot of people. And so it's great to see that Afrobarometer has emerged to be an asset and an important African institution that really captures the pulse of the continent. So congratulations to Afrobarometer. So what I'm going to do in the next few minutes, this thing about keynotes is kind of strange because sometimes you just have a speech, you read. I'm going to use some slides, so it may seem a bit strange. But I thought that some of the ideas that I wanted to convey can best be seen visually. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to use some slides in this keynote speech. And so what I want to do is to start off a little bit about contextualizing African development and the kind of stuff that if you think hard about it, keeps you awake at night. Okay? So let's go to the first slide. So this is one way, kind of messy, but one way to capture actually African economic history in recent years. I mean, if you want to capture African economic history, you have to go back 4 million years, but that's a long way away, and we don't have a lot of data to go by, but at least in the last 60 years, this is one way to think about African economic history. Okay? And what does this mean? So at the bottom, of course, are the 1960, you may not see this very well, but hopefully you'll get the slides. But, we started from 1961 all the way to 2021, most recently. And this is the green, so on the left is sub-Saharan Africa. On the right, just as a contrast, is non-African countries that are considered low middle income countries. What you see here is Africa's growth, which is a summary measure of it is wealth, in a way, as we currently measure it. And what you see is the green line, of course, the green line is sort of like day-to-day, year-to-year kind of fluctuations of economic activity, which is normal. There are recessions that come and go. There are, recoveries that come and go. But what we do with the red line is to actually show what the average growth in a particular decade has been in Africa when we adjust for population growth. And what you see is that this is a region that for the last 60 years has been a low growth region. At no time, at no decade, has it grown above 2% per capita. Okay? By contrast, the lower middle income countries, early in the 1960s started at 3%. There was a real trough in the mid-70s and early 90s, 80s and 90s, and then it goes back to 3.5%, stays there for a long time, and even after the COVID pandemic, its recovery is up to 2.5%. But look at Africa, right? So not only do we see low growth, but we also these troughs. So a decade of less than 2%, another decade Following that, that is negative growth. A recovery that is back to 2% for a decade. And then in most recent years, in the last 15 years, we've basically lost another 15 years because the per capita growth rate is around 0. Can we go to the next? We capture that here. So recoveries are short, 3 years, and then back to a recession. Compared to, say, South Asia, which is about 6 years, a recovery. East Asia, that is about 7 years, like highly industrialized countries, right? Depth of expansion, that is the difference between the growth rates from the trough to the top, is very shallow. Okay, as you can see, it's one of the lowest. Can we go to the next? And a lot of that has something to do with the fact that a lot of this growth is basically extractive based. That's what you see on the right-hand side, right? Natural capital is basically another way of saying extraction. Now, when you have that kind of growth, can we go to the next? When you have that kind of growth, low, unsustainable, with a lot of volatility, and extractive based, what you get is the kind of problem right now a lot of African governments are struggling with. And what you see here is job creation for every growth, for every percentage growth increase in percent, every percentage increase in growth in Africa, East Asia gets about twice as much job creation. Similarly, for poverty reduction, the rest of the world gets twice as much. So African growth reduces poverty at half speed than the rest of the world. And so when you see this kind of history, this raises a lot of searching questions. Why is that? And so as I said, this is the kind of stuff that, at least in my job, keeps me awake at night. Can we go to the next, please? It's very costly. So on this left is what incomes in African households would have been in the last 15 years. So between 2015 to now, what African incomes would have been if they had grown at the rate at which they grew in that period, just prior to 2014. The incomes will be 33%, 1/3 higher, 33% higher, 35% higher. That's how much losses this kind of low growth, this stuck in low growth and lack of sustainability actually means in terms of just incomes and livelihoods that this affects when it comes to poverty. And it also shows in the fact that the region basically falls behind the rest of the world. That's on the right. So you can see, for example, the green graph, which is Africa's income per capita relative to the rest of the world, and it's relatively flat and declining towards the end. The purple line is East Asia, which is almost catching up with the richest countries in the world at 90%. And then South Asia is also making progress, but at a much slower pace, right? So this is the kind of costly outcomes that Africans are experiencing because of the kinds of growth that the region have experienced in the last 60 years. Next. So here are some of the questions then. Now, I haven't started talking about data, all right? But I couldn't build that without data. We couldn't actually get those insights without data. So the talk I was asked to give was about the role and significance of data in public policy and decision making. Okay? So here are some of those questions that these kinds of mining of data, looking at the data and staring at data actually gives you. Why is African growth so low? Is it because we haven't paid attention to agricultural transformation? Could that be the reason? Is it because of all the shocks in conflict, climate, disease that is quite prevalent and quite common that we haven't been able to actually have a handle on? Is it because of inequality? Is it because the human capital accumulation is low, right? So for example, one of the things that we compute in the World Bank is something we call human capital index. And a child born today in Africa, okay, will be only 40% as productive, 40% as productive when they turn 18 to a child who would have had a full complement of education and health. Right? That's a massive source of wealth to forego. So could it be that? Could it be about institutions? Our institutions are under a lot of stress at the moment, and a lot of them have lost credibility. Could it be because of the organization of production? Right? What's the role of research and lack of it? So these are some of the searching questions that come to mind. And to be able to answer these questions, to link them to the questions and the answers to the questions that particular set of economic history poses, unless we have data, we wouldn't be able to answer these questions. So what I'm going to do is to spend the next few minutes to talk about 5 things about data that I think we should really, really pay attention to and care about, and that will be able to answer this question. So the first one, next slide please, is really about, it's the data that allows us to to connect the dots. Okay? To link what we see to something else that we see that seems very difficult. So for example, what's the link between consumption inequality, which Africa suffers from? So Africa is the second most unequal continent in the world, second only to Latin America, to lack of mobility in the labor market or in society, social mobility. What's the link between those two things? But when you really think about the organization of production in Africa and all the obstacles that entrepreneurs and talented people face that traps them in poverty, then you understand why, in fact, there's very little social mobility. And that you can only capture through data. It's the data that allows you to have those kinds of linkages to connect the dots. Next, one other way you can connect the dots, this is something very familiar to all of you. This is the Afrobarometer data. I just borrowed this straight from Joe. You can see, for example, that among the Gen Zers, okay, the approval of government performance on jobs, economy, and health from around 31 countries is declining rapidly. Okay, so we talked about lack of jobs. We talked about the poverty levels in Africa, right? We talked about the performance of the economy. So it's not a surprise that, in fact, young people grade the governments very, very poorly here, okay? So you can see that there's been substantial reduction in the approval of government performance, especially managing the economy and creating jobs. But could it be related then to the way in which young people might be withdrawing from political participation? And is that a good thing? So next one, please. So you can see here that, in fact, check, for example, the yellow line, which says a lot of young people no longer feel close to a political party, maybe because they don't offer them a message, a purpose, a program, right? Because maybe the political parties don't, right? So what is the connection between these things? So this is the kind of questions that a data, really good data allows you to answer. Next. Second thing, one obvious avenue for connecting the dots, of course, research. to do research, really good research, you need really good data, right? And this is a paper, I mean, this is information I got from this paper down here, Research Deserts and Oases. And you can see that where there is data, there is a lot more research. So there are a whole lot of countries where we know nothing at all about how people organize their production, their livelihoods, their perceptions, their aspirations, and so on, right? And yet for others, we actually have quite a lot. But even then, so this is, forgive me, this is my profession. So this is the economic profession. And what we're looking here is all the papers that have been published, 27,000 papers that have been published in economic journals. And they rank these journals, usually 10 of them that are looking at development, the top 200 journals, all the journals, the top 200, the 10 that are coming from, that are focused on development, the top 5 ranked journals, and so on and so on. And then at the end is the proportion of African authors in all these papers. And you can see nowhere, even in places like South Africa, it's less than 1%. Okay, so if we want to understand this continent and create knowledge, first we need a lot more data. 2, we need a lot of use of that data for research and provide insight and connecting the dots, right? But also, more importantly, we need a lot of African researchers to work on this continent. And I think this is why an organization like Afrobarometer is very, very important, because they actually are an African organization, and their data is used a lot in the Africa region. So that's one of the things that I wanted to mention here. But this is one of those, again, eye-opening kind of tables. Next. Second, what do we need data for? We need it for transparency and accountability, obviously. And Afrobarometer is a classic case for that. It catches the pulse of the population, gets the opinion of the population, and if the policymakers pay attention to it, they would actually be better served by acting on it. But I want to give an example of transparency. So there are a lot of things African governments don't like. They don't like to be audited, for example. Okay? But I wanted to give an example of actually what transparency can do, right? So in the 80s, there was a big movement after the structural adjustments to make central banks independent and autonomous, so that the government don't just go to them and say, oh, print money, because I want to pay these workers who are going around demonstrating in the streets, right? So the central banks basically then were given a mandate and were made autonomous. And then 3 years ago, because of a war far away, the continent was inundated with lack of food, lack of fuel. And so what happened is that inflation just skyrocketed everywhere. And central bankers, to their credit, actually acted on their mandate. And so what you see on the left is what actually inflation looks like now. So it's a large continent, lots of countries. So not every country has succeeded. There's still some where inflation is very high, but there are a lot of them, many of them. A large majority of them have actually brought inflation under control. And look at the ranking of African central banks in terms of their independence. It's second only to Europe and Central Asia. Right? So this is what transparency of, and autonomy and accountability actually does for you. It gets you better policy outcomes, right? So this is one of the reasons why, we need data for holding governments accountable. And hopefully they act on things like, Auditor General's reports. Next. Okay, so the other thing about data is, of course, how it can be incredibly important for all kinds of things that we care about, especially in production, right? So you can resolve weather uncertainty, whether you want, whether a plane needs to fly today at this hour, this evening or something like that. That will depend on a whole lot of things, but weather, uncertainty in the weather and prediction is important, all right? But there are a whole lot of other things that we need data for. Precision agriculture, right? So for example, telling farmers, oh, by the way, it's the northwest corner of your farm where there is a pest infestation. So you don't really need to go and, spray everything. Just go and spray there, okay? Or you tell them, oh, by the way, your soil is actually not very healthy. So you need to go and get lime and apply lime so that you can get, better outcome in terms of yields and so on, right? So we use data for, particularly for resolving a lot of uncertainty, but also for, decision making on, on agriculture, on diagnosis of, health diagnosis, on, school management, for example, to see, how many, are the schools here overcrowded relative to that? Are the teachers deployed better in different places? So this is all really, really important decisions that public policymakers want to make, and that can be really, really, data can be really, really important in actually helping making better decisions, right? So on, right? So next, I'm almost coming to the end. Increasingly, data actually allows us to create new technologies. Okay, a lot of you have seen these robots. Maybe you're using them in your kitchen. They come around and they clean up stuff. It's built on a lot of data, billions and billions of data, right? Self-driving cars are tested, are being over-tested and tested, and they're collecting all kinds of data. And so we think of data as just these bytes, right? These digital numbers. But increasingly, data is you and me, objects, right? That these cars have to avoid, right? As they navigate the roads and things like that. So even our imagination of what actually constitutes data is beginning to change precisely because of this. ChatGPT, I don't know, many of you will probably be using ChatGPT quite a bit and will find it fascinating because sometimes it completely makes up data. As I did, I tried, and it gave me a completely new citation that didn't exist. So be careful with ChatGPT, which is what is my next point. Could we go to the next one? My next point is really that even as we actually are coming upon enormous volumes of data and are creating these new technologies, are making these better decisions in precision and be very precise, we are also facing incredible challenge in terms of misinformation, okay? And this misinformation through chatbots, through all kinds of platforms, right, is creating a lot of social tension, social fractures, and of course, potentially state collapse or societal collapse and conflict. So we have to be very careful. But even there, my argument here is that the point I want to make here is that actually good, accurate, verifiable data is one of the best ways to fight that misinformation. Okay? So even while people can use data for misinforming, you could actually use the same but a different set of data to fight that misinformation and to tell the truth. Okay? So that's something I thought I think we should underline. So next. So let me conclude, because I don't know how long I have been rambling around, but we all know data is now the currency of information and knowledge. So, and I just gave you a sliver of that when I ran through these slides. But I think it is fair to say that in Africa and African policymaking do not use data enough. Okay? I'm going to make a call for more use of data that captures the pulse of the population, such as Afrobarometer and many others. Increasingly, we get a lot of surveys, survey monkeys, from all kinds of sites, and that's important, right? We need better administrative data that captures the reach of programs, the impact of programs, the evaluation of programs, and so on and so on. Because I think that's the way for us to be able to judge whether a government program is effective, it's actually having its intended impact or not. And we need data that allows us to respond to a lot of shocks that we now experience, disasters, emergencies of all kinds, that are going to be just a lot more than we've seen so far, because our climate is changing, our societies are changing, and there are all kinds of tensions that are rising. We need high-frequency data to be able to use this to respond appropriately and usefully. And so that will be my concluding remarks, and thank you so much for listening to me.
Thank you very much, Andrew, for the very insightful presentation. Now it's time to look at the findings that we've been making so much noise about. We'll call on our Director of Surveys, Boniface Zurani, to present our latest findings on democratic trends in Africa.
Thank you, Josephine. There's quite a lot for us to cover, so I'll only provide the key highlights from the report in my presentation. But I'd like to invite all of us to take the opportunity to get to read our flagship report. As we wait, I think, for the slides to get started, I just wanted to highlight, to point out that Africa's trajectory with democracy can be maybe illustrated best by the example of Mali. In 1992, Malians celebrated the birth of democracy in their country. Move on 30 years later, a lot of Malians again went on the streets to celebrate military rule in their country. And this really begs the question, when we see the youth, I think our keynote speaker has pointed out, and I think as our Chief Executive Officer has also highlighted, when you see the youth on the streets celebrating military rule, it begs the question, is democracy at risk on this continent? We've also seen, I think, the youth in Kenya on the streets, challenging government because of issues to do with corruption, mismanagement of the economy and the like. Again, begging the question, is democracy at risk? In this presentation, I am going to highlight, I think, a number of areas. I only have maybe 20, 25 minutes. So start with an overview of who we are as Afrobarometer, but mindful that most of us already know who we are. I'll just, I want to spend a lot of time on that. Then I will also be highlighting trends from our surveys over time in terms of popular satisfaction with and support for democracy. We'll also look at, I think, some highlights on quality of elections, the youth and their views on democracy and gender gaps, among other, other issues. The takeaway home message, if we start with a kind of a conclusion. Despite, I think, all the obvious signs that democracy is in trouble on the continent, the good news is democracy and support for democracy among most Africans remains very robust and pretty strong. Yes, we've seen it, we've seen it declines over the past couple of years, but generally speaking, I think majorities of our citizens, actually large majorities, are very supportive of democracy. We do see, of course, growing majorities calling for government, government accountability, as indeed we are seeing at the moment in Kenya and other places, with the youth calling for greater accountability, an end to corruption, as well as, calling for the rule of law, and as well as support for other democratic norms remains steady and I think, quite high over time. I think where the problem and the challenge that we face comes in, I think, when we look at support, satisfaction with democracy. We see that the support for democracy has declined marginally, as well as the satisfaction. But more worrisome is the fact that the support for military rule has been increasing, while rejection rates of military rule have been on the decline. More than half, and I think more than half of the citizens on this continent, accept, as I've already said, military rule. So on the demand side, I think there are those, support and preference for democracy is high, but has been declining. Rejection of certain modes of authoritarian rule have also been on the decline. But looking at the supply side of democracy, we find that this is where I think most of the challenges exist. Less than half of our citizens on this continent, and as our CEO pointed out, we are capturing in our surveys the views of more than 8 in 10 of the citizens of this continent that we call home. More than, less than half say that their countries are democratic, so the quality of democracy is in question. And then we also see that less than about just around a third say that they are satisfied with the democracy on offer. And of course, there is a variation from country to country on this continent. In terms of looking at drivers, what is driving support or dissatisfaction with democracy, support for democracy, among others? So we see that how countries or how democratic countries perform is strongly associated with the so demand for democracy, satisfaction for democracy is directly linked with the economic performance. So when countries, the economies are performing badly, then this tends to have a negative effect on democracy. So that's really in a glance, and we'll come back to these issues in a moment. Just looking at just a quick reminder of who we are as Afrobarometer. Our CEO already highlighted this, that we are a Pan-African organization that focuses and specializes on survey research. Our goal is to make sure that the voices of ordinary African citizens are heard and reflected
in policy, policy making on the continent. For a long time, I think as our keynote speaker pointed out, for a long time we always had experts that spoke on behalf of African citizens without necessarily asking them what exactly their views about the issues that affect them are. So as Afrobarometer, we go to what I consider to be the real experts, the people themselves, to tell us what they think about the issues of governance, of economics that affect them. To date, we've done a total of 9 survey rounds, starting in 1999 with 12, and then covering, as our CEO has pointed out, up to more than 40 countries as of now. We've just embarked on our 10th round of surveys this year, and we hope to cover up to 40 countries. I will show, I think, a map in a moment that highlights, I think, the coverage, our continental coverage. You'll see that we are covering quite a lot of the continent at the moment, but we do have that gray area in the middle of Africa, moving from Sea, where we currently not covering. This, in this current round of surveys, we will at least be covering Chad, so we will not have that gap anymore. At least that part of Chad will be filled, and we will also be adding Comoros as well as Equatorial Guinea among the countries that we cover. I think what makes us quite unique, I think, is the fact that we do have data going back to 1999 for quite a good number of countries on the continent. In terms of methodology, we are known to be the gold standard of surveys on this continent, and I would dare suggest that even going beyond the African continent. We have national representative surveys, so our data can speak, I think, to the views of all the citizens in the countries where we are working. We do mostly face-to-face surveys as our main mode of collecting data, but if some of you were here earlier, as we also heard from some of the speakers that were pre-recorded, we also have been experimenting with other modes of collecting data, including telephone surveys. But the face-to-face option remains our main way of collecting data. We also do have a standard questionnaire that we use in all the survey countries, and it's great to see quite a number of our national partner representatives in here to show that it allows, I think this allows us for comparison of the data that we have. Usually in terms of sample size, we have 1,000 to 200 respondents per country, or up to 2,400, which give us margins of error of plus minus 2% or plus minus 3%, depending, I think, on the sample size. So that's in a nutshell who we are and how we operate as Afrobarometer. But as we are here, our main thing is to hear about the democratic trends. So starting with popular, trends in popular satisfaction and support over time. Looking at just one point in time, and this is between 2021 and 2023, which represents our, the data that we collected in our 9th survey round. 80%, so 8 in 10 of Africans reject one-man rule. And as we'll see in a moment, those numbers are holding steady for more than for the past 10 years. So Africans are done basically with dictatorship. There might be some leaders who might want to become dictators, but the African citizens are telling us, no, we are sick and tired of dictatorship. Rejection of one-party rule, so more than 3 in 4 rejecting one-party rule. However, when it comes to military rule, 2/3 say they don't want the military to govern. But as you see in a moment, those numbers, I think, are where we have seen the largest fall in the past 10 years. In terms of preference for democracy, 6% again say that they prefer democracy to any other form of government, even if they are faced with the economic challenges. So looking at the trends over time in terms of support for democracy and rejection of authoritarian alternatives. In terms of rejection of one-man rule or dictatorship, as already pointed out, we see just about minus 3 percentage point decline in the last 10 years, from 2011 to 2023. So again, those numbers holding is steady. Rejection of one-party rule, no change over the last 10 years. So we are again holding it steady in terms of rejection of one-party rule. Where the biggest challenge is, as already pointed out, is when it comes to military rule. Rejection of military rule, when the slides come back, we will see that it has gone down by minus 11 percentage points over time. So an increasing number of our citizens are saying, maybe when things don't go well with democracy, we can look at the military as an option. But as you also see from the report, this kind of preference for military rule is not permanent. Most of our citizens are looking at the military as a temporary solution. Okay, come in, clean things up, and then very quickly go away. We still want our democratic leaders to be the ones who are governing us. In terms of trends in support of democratic norms, again, some declines, but by and large, I think in a number of areas, numbers really holding steady. Support for elections as the mode of electing leaders, has gone down by about minus 8 percentage points. But there are also some positive stories. In terms of presidency complying with the court decisions, even when they don't agree with them, we see that the numbers of presidents are increasingly becoming compliant with the rules. So an increase there of about 6 percentage points. In terms of support for presidential term limits, which is a subject that is very close to my heart, we also see that a lot of African citizens remain, I think, consistently supportive of limiting presidents to serving a maximum of 2 terms. And this is quite interesting because usually when presidents seek to remove term limits, one of the most common refrains is the people need to stay on. And yet I think the data shows that Africans want their presidents to be term limited. And I recall, I think, when the late President Pierre Nkurunziza of Burundi wanted to go for a 3rd term, it was the same argument. The people want me. And yet when we presented and confronted them, the government with our data to show that the majority of Burundians actually wanted their presidents to be term limited. So by and large, I think the story here is that support for democratic norms, even though it has declined marginally here and there, Africans remain, I think, committed to these democratic norms. They want, I think, the media to be free to criticize the governments, and actually the proportion of people supporting media freedom to report on a government freely has been going up. In terms of governments that are accountable, again, a 9 percentage point increase in those numbers. Can we get it into slideshow, please? In terms of preference for democracy, when our citizens are asked, do you support democracy, and the who express a preference for democracy, as we already highlighted, remains very high. But we do see a kind of a varied picture on the continent. At the top, among Maswati, we've seen an increase in 9 percentage points. So in terms of preference for democracy over other forms of government, an increase in a number of countries, including Eswatini, in Sierra Leone, And not surprisingly also in Kenya, and I'm sure when we get the most recent data for Kenya, the jump there is most likely to be even higher. Countries, Morocco and others, including, I think, Uganda, support for democracy are going up. But of course, the story is not all rosy. There are a number of countries where support and preference for democracy has gone down. And most worrisomely, perhaps, South Africa is at the bottom, where support for democracy has gone down by minus 29 percentage points. Other countries, I think, maybe not surprisingly, Mali, I think, which is currently under military rule. Other countries, including my own home country of Malawi, where support for democracy, embarrassingly, I should admit, has gone down by minus 18 percentage points. I hope that my CEO doesn't hold that against me at my next review. But I think in the next slide, I think we'll also look at the rejection of military rule. And as we said, I think, we see variation in some countries, but only a few countries have rejection of military rule gone up. I think by my count, looking at our data, there are only 3 countries where rejection of military rule has actually gone up. And that's Morocco, Tanzania, and Mozambique. Both Morocco, Tanzania, and Mozambique, more or less holding steady and just going up by plus 1 percentage point. But for the most part, you just look at the countries from Sudan, Eswatini, going down all the way to Mali, rejection of military rule have gone down. In the case of Mali and Burkina Faso, again, both 2 countries that are under military rule are going down by minus 40 and minus 36 percentage points. But perhaps these are the countries that you could say, okay, they're already under military rule, but what is more worrying are those countries that are on paper democratic, but the rejection of military rule remains very high. So countries like Cote d'Ivoire, Cameroon, and even our host here, Ghana, where rejection of military rule has gone down. I should add, though, that in some of these cases, we are starting from a very high point. So even though we have seen declines, majorities still reject military rule. So maybe we should be very cautious in terms of how we interpret some of those numbers. Looking at, the next slide, please. Looking at the supply of democratic norms and institutions. Speaking, there are concerns about the quality of elections, and not surprisingly, I think we see more people telling us that the quality of elections has been getting worse over time. So, a decline of minus 7 percentage points in terms of the proportion of people that consider the previous elections to have been free and fair. And then also the proportion of citizens that in the previous, in one of the previous slides, I talked about more people, telling us that the presidents are respecting, the proportion of people wanting the presidents to be bound by the laws are going up. On the other hand, on the supply side, we see that actually, more people think that their presidency are ignoring courts, as well as ignoring parliaments, as well as the proportion of people considering their countries not to be democratic. That has been the proportion of people saying their countries remain a democracy, the proportion has gone down. More worrisomely again, the proportion of African citizens that are satisfied with the quality of democracy has gone down. And as we will see, I think, and as we've seen, I think in the cases where we've seen these protests, obviously there is increasing disillusionment with the quality of democracy, and especially among the youth, that in the end they end up looking at other alternative means, including going on the streets. Moving on, I think, to the next slide, where we'll look at the satisfaction with the democracy. Again, the story is quite mixed in terms of some countries being citizens in some countries getting more and more satisfied over time, whereas for the majority of our countries, though, the levels of satisfaction with democracy have been going down. And this, again, looking at the bottom country on this list, Botswana, which is considered one of our strongest democracies, the satisfaction levels are actually have gone down the most in Botswana, as well as Mauritius, two African countries that are considered to be the strongest democracies on the continent. And of course, you see South Africa there with 35% decline in satisfaction, as well as Lesotho and Eswatini, again, even here with our hosts in Ghana. So again, the quality of democracy needs to improve, and as we'll see later on, and I think one way to do this is to deliver on people's expectation as well as people's preferences. Now, should the military intervene in politics? That's our next question. And looking at this question that we've only started to ask since our last survey round to look at this question. Across the 39 countries where this question was asked, just slightly over half, 53%, do acquiesce to the fact that the military should intervene in politics. The question actually, presents our respondents with two questions, two statements. The first one, the military or the armed forces should never intervene in the country's political process, or it is legitimate for the armed forces to take control of government when elected use power for their own ends. So, on the right, I think, is that orange, or is it yellow? You'll excuse my color blindness here. Are the numbers, in percentages of those who say, yes, the armed forces should, it is legitimate for the armed forces to take control of government when elected leaders abuse power. And it's conditional. It's not automatic. Only when they abuse power, and as we've been finding out, and not indefinitely. Only when those democratic leaders abuse power. Of course, the numbers have vary from again across the continent, but at the very top, and I think we've indicated some of the countries that are currently under military rule are ranking up at the top. But some countries as well that like Tunisia, again Cote d'Ivoire, and as I said, these are the countries that we need to be worried about. And I think that's where now our data has to predict some of the potential trouble spots on the continent. Because if you have majorities in countries like Seychelles or Mauritius saying, the military should not intervene, if the military were to do so, chances are we'll never get to see people celebrating on the streets. So what drives these changes in democratic satisfaction? We look at economic as well as political factors. Economic factors are significant drivers in satisfaction with democracy. The number of people, the more the people say their country's economic conditions is good, the more likely people are going to be satisfied with democracy. The more the number of people who say that their country is headed in the right direction, again, the more the satisfaction levels. Government's performance in economic management, again, very positive impact. Creation of jobs, and I think, increasingly we find that more and more of our citizens, especially the youth, one of the many, their many concerns is job creation. So the more governments are rated as doing good job in job creation, the more satisfied people are, and then the provision of electricity, again, and having a positive relationship with the, democratic satisfaction. On the political side, there are again some positive as well as negative drivers. When elections are free and fair, that tends to lead to greater satisfaction with democracy. When government officials, especially senior public officials, are held accountable when they break the law, again, greater satisfaction with democracy. But when the ordinary people, and this one is not significant anyway, so I'll skip it. But I think two of the negative drivers of satisfaction in democracy are corruption, especially among officials in the public, in the president's office, as well as at the local government level, and this tends to have negative effects, negative relations with the democratic satisfaction. Moving on, I think to look at drivers in change, in support for democracy. On this one, I think the economic drivers really are all not significantly related to support for democracy. The main, I think, drivers of support for democracy are, I think, political. And this includes, again, free and fair elections, holding a government, individuals accountable for their actions, especially public officials, as well as, I think, ordinary citizens when also being held accountable when they are, they break the law. But more importantly, also, when the government, local government councillors are corrupt, that tends to have, in terms of corruption, local government councillors especially tends to have a negative effect on support for democracy. And this is quite interesting because local government councillors are at, much closer to the citizens on the ground. In the interest of time, if we just move on to the slide on, how free and, whether citizens on this continent feel free to vote without being pressured. And this is again where we have we have a positive story. Across 39 countries, we see that about 66, about 2/3 of our citizens tell us that they feel free to vote for a government of their choice, to vote for individuals of their choice without being pressured to vote for particular individuals. Because this story is not uniform, and there are a few cases that are important to take note of. Ethiopia, where only about 310 say they feel free to vote without feeling pressured. In Eswatini, in Gabon, and a good number of countries, actually about 8 or so, where less than half of the citizens feel that they are completely free to vote without feeling pressured. In terms of how good elections are, to ensure that people who are elected reflect the views of ordinary citizens. So in this case, I think looking at legislators, only 42% feel the elections are good and positive means of electing individuals that once they are in office, they reflect the well-being of voters. So basically, more people feel that the elections are not a good tool for ensuring that the MPs reflect the views of voters. So a disconnect there between voters and their expectations and the individuals that are elected. And in terms of using elections to remove non-performing leaders, just less than half feel that elections are a good way of removing non-performers, whereas half feel that they don't do such a good job. And that's why, again, we end up with people going on the streets. Moving on, I think, to look at The youth, Generation Z. I don't know whether, I don't know how far ago I would have qualified to be part of Generation Z, but I guess I'm past that, unfortunately. Now, there are some, I think, areas here of concern. While I think the youth, sometimes can engage, as we have seen, I think, in Kenya, there are a number of areas where the youth are really not engaging as much as their older counterparts. So in terms of preference to democracy, the youth are at the bottom in terms of the proportion of youth that say they prefer democracy. It could be, of course, that the disillusionment and dissatisfaction levels are very high. And indeed, you might also find that this might translate into preference for other authoritarian modes of governance, especially those that they did not themselves experience. So you see, in terms of rejection of military rule, the youth are the least, rejectors of military rule. They are basically the same in terms of rejection of dictatorship. So the youth are more likely to look at military rule, and especially even in countries where the youth have never had that experience of military rule. So I think in some of the analysis that we've done, we find that the older folk, even though they also just as dissatisfied with democracy, they are less likely to support some of these forms of government. Lastly, looking at issues of gender, in terms of asking whether women should also be given the same opportunities to govern. This is, I think, there's a positive story here that more and more people, and the numbers here are steady, say that women should have equal chance to be elected. And then the proportion of respondents in our surveys that tell us that men make better leaders has actually been on the decline. And I think this is, again, as we've seen more and more women take up leadership positions and demonstrate their capabilities. I think then a lot more people have had that experience in knowing that there shouldn't be any differences. In terms of political participation, I think there are some gender differences here. The major ones, by and large, I think we see that men, at least in our surveys, tell us that they participate more in politics than women. There are basically no exceptions here where women tell us that they participate more. So we really need to open up opportunities for women, I think, to participate and to participate more in this, in the political space, because what this data is showing us is that the political spaces are still, I think, gendered, and there's need for opening up more. I will close, I think, in my presentation just highlighting that one of the outputs from our surveys is the creation of democracy scorecards. And we have these for each country for which we are doing our surveys. We have an example here of a democracy scorecard for Ghana that gives highlights on demand for democracy over time, supply for democracy, among others. And I think the next slide is, again, another example of Mali, where we present these same numbers, the same trends for Mali, and we do this for all the 39 countries for which we do have data available. So I'd like you to invite all of us, if we have a chance, to take a look at these democracy scorecards and to track, I think, to track progress and the trends over time. So by way of concluding, I'd like you to conclude, I think, by just highlighting the fact that most of our African citizens continue to voice strong support for democracy, and that the commitment to democracy is and has been resilient over time, even in the face of disappointing government performance and even disappointment in the democracy itself, disappointment in delivery of economic progress, creation of jobs, economic mismanagement, and the like. But the support for democracy remains quite high. So on the demand side, we are doing well. Where I think we face challenges are on the supply side, where we see satisfaction with democracy declining, the quality of democracy, a lot of people telling us it's not as good, and of course the ability of democracy to deliver also being in question. I'll stop here, and as I said, I would like to invite all of you to read the report because it covers way more than what I've been able to present here, and I thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Bonnie. So it's time for a panel discussion, and I'm sure we're all looking forward to that. But before we get into it, can we do a little social media exercise? How many of us have tweeted since we came? Awesome. So we're just going to share the hashtags on the board, on the screen. The hashtags are African Insights 2024. That's the title of our flagship report. We also have Afrobarometer 25 and Voices Africa. Don't forget to tag us, Afrobarometer, on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, LinkedIn. So can we all tweet what we think is the most fascinating finding among all the that Bonnie just shared? Don't forget to tag us and use the hashtag. Okay. I have the pleasure of introducing our moderator for the panel discussion. She is an international broadcaster and filmmaker. She has over 4 decades of experience with the British media. She's best known for her work with BBC, and we're proud to say that she's a member of our International Advisory Council. And she's also the president of the School of Oriental and African Studies in London. Please help me welcome on stage Zainab Badawi.
All right, while they are adjusting the furniture, I'll just say hello to all of you, excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, friends and colleagues. It's wonderful to be with you. I do love a birthday party, especially when it's one so worthy for such an august organization as Afrobarometer. And indeed, for many years of my broadcast journalist career, I have always considered the information that you get from Afrobarometer as giving us a kind of gold standard of what's going on in the continent. They had the prescience to make to do this work when nobody else was doing it. So I've really been the beneficiary of that, and it's been a great privilege for me to work with them at close range. So we've heard a lot from our esteemed speakers this morning. Andrew from the World Bank and Boniface giving us an excellent summary of this African Insights report, and of course Joe, who kicked off the whole proceedings. So we're just going to be kicking around some of the ideas and the trends that emerged with my esteemed panel here. We'll be talking for about 45 minutes, so I've slightly reduced the time because we did start a little bit late, and I'm well aware that it's only us who stand between you and your lunch. So, and while they are being mic'd up, let me just tell you who we've got with us. So, Somebody who really needs no introduction, but I'm obliged to give him one, is of course Professor Jima Boadi, who is one of the co-founders and chairs of Afrobarometer, one of Africa's most distinguished academics. He's worked as an academic both here in Ghana at the University of Legon and also in the United States. He has myriad awards, you know, so many accolades, far too numerous to mention, but he's both a member of the National Academy of Sciences in the United States and also the National Academy of the Sciences and the Arts here in Ghana, and a man who has really throughout the decades proved his commitment and his tenacity to underscoring everything he does with rigorous academic research. Next to him is Mayor Yvonne Akisoya, who has been mayor of Freetown, the capital of Sierra Leone, since 2018. She's now been re-elected for a second term. Congratulations, Yvonne. She's also somebody who's had 25 years as a career as a finance professional, and so she brings that kind of private sector experience to everything she does in her public service role. Very data-driven, so everything that she's heard has been music to her ears, and she's trying to do the best she can, as we will hear, to ensure that there is an accountable, democratic local government in Freetown, as well as trying to develop and bring jobs using technology, heritage and tourism, and so on. Ruqayya Kassanali, Dr. Ruqayya Kassanali is, again, one of Africa's distinguished scholars and scholar activists. She's from Mauritius, where she's an associate professor at the University of Mauritius. She's the chair of the Electoral Institute for Democratic Sustainability. Bit of a mouthful, Ruqayya. And she is a serial think tank person, really, because she co-founded several think tanks. And again, she's somebody who believes in the power of accountability and, you know, democracy and the role of civil society in furthering the right democratic values and norms. And then next to me here is Justice Chifundo Kachali from Malawi. He's a High Court judge in Malawi, and until a month ago, he was chair of the Electoral Commission in Malawi. And we'll hear a bit more about what went on in the Electoral Commission when it had to adjudicate on that disputed 2019 election. And then, of course, there was the election in 2020, which he missed by a couple of weeks, having to adjudicate over that. And he's, again, somebody who really believes in excellence in public service. So that is our panel. Please welcome them. Let me start off by asking all of you, in this order, just very quick, rapid fire. You heard Boniface give us that excellent summary of the African Insights report, which we now know is going to be a regular publication from Afrobarometer. Give us just a quick, off the top of your head, standout message. Jima.
Well, for me, for a continent that is often highly deficient in government effectiveness and in effective delivery of government services, it's remarkable that an increasing number of Africans are saying that they would rather have a government that is accountable, even if it's not so effective, versus a government that is effective but not accountable. That is saying a lot.
Very interesting. We'll be putting flesh on the bones of all these comments. Yvonne.
I think I was particularly struck by the fact that the youth have taken a view where they're seeing the prospect of military leadership or governance as being preferable to democracy. I think that's a real wake-up call, given that we are such a youthful continent, average age of 19. So if that's the direction of thought, then there's a big responsibility. The local government councillors piece could not have passed my attention either. The responsibility of governments, it was two. It was local government, office of the president. So the highest level, the lowest level. That's what people are looking for. So the responsibility for those of us in governance to ensure that these trends and these perceptions are married, I think is just heightened by the report.
All right. You seem to have some thunder behind you on your microphone.
Yes,
Maybe just
I
try
see
moving
it.
it a little bit further away from your mouth, the bottom bit. Or maybe one of the sound technicians could have a look at it while we're carrying on our talk. Yeah, it's all happening, isn't it? Sounds like fireworks. Rukeya.
Thanks, Zainab. I think it's the clear mismatch between what governments and heads of state say.
Can you hear Rukeya? That's okay, that's just a windshield. Okay.
I think a clear mismatch between what governments and heads of state say about themselves and what people are saying about what they think about their governments. And I think there is now this understanding that people are ready to fight for their rights, whether it's political rights or for their civil rights. So I think the message is quite clear out there.
Okay. Chifundo.
I think as somebody who just had the privilege of working on an EMB, I think I'm quite struck by the reaction of the community or the society on the quality of elections, on their level of satisfaction with democracy. It just heightens the responsibility that people who actually arrange that event, which allows people to choose their leaders, the onerous burden they carry to ensure that democracy remains credible is quite strong for me as an observation.
Okay, great. So we'll develop all those thoughts, but let's just start off with you, Professor Jima. We are marking 25 years of Afrobarometer, and given your historic connection with it, your kind of its institutional memory, just give us an overview of how, what kind of impact it has had on our understanding of African democracy, governance, and social conditions on the continent.
Well, there's a lot to say, but I'll try my best to be brief. First, before, let's say if you take our minds back to some 30 years ago, maybe 20 years ago, the common refrain across academic halls, in academic conferences, among media pundits was that Africans don't care about how they were governed. All that they cared about was being governed well. On the back of this, a whole number of wrong things got done. So a typical African leader would say, well, my people really like me, but they believe that they want to be quiet, they want to be quiescent, they want to be compliant, and they want me to even oppress them so that I bring them development. Well, thanks to multiple rounds of Afrobarometer, we know that is not true, and that most Africans, if they have their way, will prefer to live under governments that are democratic and accountable. Second, as you go, even today, you run into incumbent presidents who say, well, my people really think I'm doing great, or they want to give me a chance. And it's so great to have Afrobarometer data to confront them and to just tell them the truth that citizens do want you to have a limited tenure, no matter how great you think you are. And I think those two data points alone, for me, make the Afrobarometer experience a worthy one and a great one.
Thank you. Yvonne, you heard Andrew from the World Bank talking about the importance of data, and that's something which is very close to your heart. You've taken a very kind of data-driven approach to your role as Mayor of Freetown. So just give us some of the lessons learnt from your experience and why data is so important to you.
Thank you. I think, just building on what Andrew said about if you don't have the information, you can't draw the conclusions. So when I came into office in 2018, in my first 3 months, we conducted an exercise through which
That's okay.
we conducted an exercise. Is that better? Can I just use your mic?
There may be another one. Let me just see. Let's just see if we can sort this out, because I think a handheld mic for Yvonne would be better. It's just, if I relinquish one, we solve one problem, but we create another. Nobody can hear me then afterwards. We'll have to hand it backwards and forwards. So they are bringing you another one. Thank you so much. But start your answer again, because there was so much interference. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, it's working.
Should be on.
It's on?
Mhm.
Yes. So as I was saying, I think the bottom line is...
Let's just take that one away. Just hand me the other one. Hand me the other one. The headphone one. Yeah. It's just me maybe creating some interference. So I can hand it to somebody. God, it sounds like some kind of dinosaur, doesn't it? What have you got under the ground here? Right, okay. Good.
Are we good? The previous council was doing. Moving on from that level of engagement gave us very important information, which allowed us to create Transform Freetown, effectively design a development agenda on 4 clusters, 11 priority sectors, 19 specific targets. And what worked best for us was the fact that we reported to our residents on an annual basis on how we were doing against those targets. Fast forward 5 years, major areas that we built data in, because this is a challenge in many cities in Africa, that the data wasn't there. The baselines weren't there. But we built data through our revenue mobilization efforts. We geo-mapped the entire city, got that. We're addressing deforestation. So Freetown, the Tree Town, was a target to plant 1 million trees. Each tree is tagged, has its unique identifier, is part of a digital platform, and
problem that the Afrobarometer insights has focused on is the supply side failure of democratic norms and the institution and practice of government. A couple of things that we've seen is what I call the executive expansion. That is, it has spread itself systematically across all systems. So in terms of parliament, the only one that is left for the moment standing or semi-standing is the judiciary. The institutions have more or less crumbled when we're looking at institutions of checks and balances, audit, the anti-corruption, the central bank. There will be an issue around the independence of central bank, because we've seen in the last couple of years the central bank, in the case of Mauritius, becoming really part and parcel of the executive expansion and taking orders from the executive. We've seen, so as I said, the capture of institutions, the nomination process being very much through political patronage, not always the best person in for the best job, which means that, checks and balances have become very weak. I think one of also the biggest problems is the current electoral system. We have been handed over by our past colonial master, the first past the post, which is mostly of the British system. And although it has delivered, it has created what I call those massive majorities, which provide, a sense of impunity to those who are in power. So we've had, I think in the case of Mauritius, on 2 occasions where, we had the 60 zeros, which means practically no opposition, wiped out completely opposition in 82 and 1995, which meant that, this system of oversight and check and balance has weakened over time. And the other element is the political culture itself that has changed. We obviously know that ideology doesn't exist, but a type of political culture that has fed in terms of ethnicization of our society, which means that ethnic quotas, ethnic preferences. I think the latest US state report had talked about the fact that there is growing tension between communities, with a particular community or ethnic community, the Hindu community, overtaking the rest. So I think these types of tensions, of unease that have been fed in the hands of politicians, pandering to those types of aspiration, have created a number of cracks. And I think that's where this dissatisfaction in democracy has happened. And I think in the last election, 2019, we saw, a number of electoral petitions that were filed in court, and most of them have been thrown out. But that has shown, worrisome trends, I would say. I'm not saying that there has been electoral fraud, but there has been worrisome trends in terms of the way elections have been conducted, and I'm very skeptical about this term free and fair. I think we are increasingly needing to talk about the integrity of elections to deliver in terms of expectation. And then last but not least, I think it's also the fact that we, as Mauritians, have become very blasé about the fact that we've never had to fight the independence. Independence was given to us more or less on a platter. We've had not those liberation movements that have really fostered this need for contestation and protest politics. We saw a couple of them 2-3 years ago when we had this major oil spill in Mauritius, the Wakasho oil spill. But since then, people go back to their normal, running of the mill sort of issues. So I think all this sort of collection of issues that I just highlighted has created a dissatisfaction, and people realize that elections probably are not the only way and the only method of delivering on change. And I think the fact that, last but not least, is that they've seen the same people in power. So you were talking about the Jagannath families.
How many years have we had? It was the father before him.
It was the father before him, it's now the son, and then we had the Ramgulam family, which was the father and the son. So two families, two dynasties, which is not untypical of Africa, but it is very, it creates tensions and problems around, expectations of who can become a prime minister in Mauritius when you have only two families in a small space like that.
Yeah. I mean, what's the point? It's like just over 1 million people, isn't it?
1.5,
yeah.
1.5, which is small, but I think when you see the absence of turnover, but also coupled with ethnicization and casteism, which means that only a particular caste from a particular community can aspire to become a prime minister, that really sort of narrows that space for aspiration among potential renewal.
Okay, good. We'll pick up actually this whole theme of ethnicization, which didn't particularly appear in the report. The link between corruption and staying in power for a long time, and the overlap with ethnicity. But you also said very quickly, Rike, if I didn't mishear you, that elections aren't necessarily the best way of delivering. Is that what you said?
No. I
not
said
the only way.
Not the only one, because I think people have realized that money politics plays in a big role. The fact that the types of candidates you sort of bring forward, and it's not always on competence. And I think this issue as well, which we saw that there needs to be more women in politics. But there are so many barriers for women to get into politics.
So elections with integrity is what you say, rather than just
and
the
competitive
free and fair
and open, so that everyone knows the rules of the game.
And the electoral, you can have democratic elections, and it can throw up one-party rule. It can throw up, as we've seen in South Africa with the ANC, except this time they were tested and are having to govern in coalition. All right, but sticking with elections, Justice Kachali, you are from Malawi, and we saw in 2019 how the election there had to be adjudicated on. So it was Peter Mutharika, the incumbent, who you can remind us all, who said he'd won the election, but his opponent, the current president, Lazarus Chakwera, disputed the election, and the Electoral Commission got involved, and actually they said, yes, it's not correct, and Peter Muharrika at least had the decency to step aside, didn't he? So you weren't chair of the Electoral Commission then, but perhaps just remind everybody about what happened and how the Electoral Commission showed it had some teeth.
Well, thank you so much. So what happened in 2019 was when the results of elections were declared, the opposition candidates contested in court, predominantly alleging that there was some lack of integrity in the entire process. So the court reduced the case to a constitutional dispute, and so the High Court was empaneled as a constitutional court, and the proceedings happened to take place also during the public health emergency of the COVID-19, which had its own implications. But fast forward to February 2020, the court nullified the election results and ordered a fresh presidential election to happen. And at that stage, the previous commission's tenure had expired and the chair of the commission resigned. And at that point, that's when our cohort came into office. So we came into office 2 weeks before the deadline for holding the fresh presidential election. And now coming back to the whole issue of data, when everybody knew we only had 2 weeks, everybody was concerned whether we could do the work. But the approach we adopted in our commission was to go back to the Secretariat and demand up-to-date data-based reports on the level of preparedness. When we did that exercise, within 2 days we were able to find out that we were almost 80+% ready to do the election. And so we're confident about our capacity to actually deliver the elections in the time available. But the main lessons I think we learned, speaking for myself as a judicial officer, is that in 2020, we discovered that unless you change the legal culture on the bench in the judiciary, changing the text of the Constitution may not necessarily deliver constitutionalism. So the same Constitution that the courts have been applying since 1994, allowing candidates to go into power with a threshold of less than 50% plus one, for example, when the new court sat in 2020, they declared that threshold to be too low, and they reinterpreted what majority meant. And the same courts that had previously upheld elections that had irregularities on a quantitative basis, the new court said that quality matters more than quantity. So the quality, the integrity of the process must measure up to a qualitative analysis. And on that score, the court said, Electoral Commission, you failed your job, go and do it again. Now, it means for me, and it wasn't a coincidence for me, because the PhD research I had done for my PhD in SOAS was based on interrogating the impact of a judicial culture on constitutional law reforms in Malawi. And some of the findings were that exactly that unless you change the legal culture of the bench, changing the text of the law doesn't give you the results you require. So when I saw the composition of the panel, I was quite confident that they'll do the right job, okay? Because I knew that these are judges whose perspective on the law had been informed by their training in the new constitution. So you didn't have the old guard of judges who were reading the same text but using the old lenses. So that for me was a big factor. But beyond that, something which is not adequately emphasized upon in my view is also the ethical integrity of the bench itself. Because as you might be aware, following on that case, there was a big business magnate who was actually convicted in court on allegations that he had been trying to bribe the judges. So even if you have a technically competent bench, but if they lack the moral backbone, then people will always be shortchanged. So a lot of emphasis is focused on institutions and on documentation, but I don't feel like we pay adequate attention to the people, because Electoral Commission, judiciary, government, police, local government, they are run by people. And I do believe that if we're going to make our democracies deliver, we must pay closer attention, not only to the technical proficiency of those who run those offices, but also to the moral fiber that constitutes their capacity to actually deliver. Because if we neglect that, in my view, no wonder that there is so much disillusionment on the ground, because you have many people who can talk a good show, but then lack the capacity and stamina to deliver when they get in the office.
So just while you're fixing your mic, you raise very important issues there. I'd like you all to comment actually on the importance of an independent judiciary, an effective constitutional court. We saw how that worked very effectively in South Africa when, various cases and so on. So who'd like to come in on the importance of the judiciary when we're talking about respect for institutions, democratic institutions? Yeah.
I also wanted to say something to picking from the Afrobarometer database to affect importance of elections to Africans. We did learn from the lead election by the we learned earlier on that African support for elections as the sole mechanism for choosing our political leaders has experienced some decline in a 10-year period. But first, we still need to remember that support for elections happen to be one of the most subscribed norms of democracy across Africa. And even when we say it has declined, it is still standing at 75% of the average African population. That's huge. And then related to that, we find that one of the factors, one of the things that create a spike in citizen support for democracy is actually related to the quality of elections. When elections have been held in a country, and especially when those elections resulted in an electoral turnover, there tends to be a spike in popular support for democracy when you survey the country after the elections. So
I was going to say, but if you have perfect elections and they don't deliver for the citizen, then what's the point? I mean, it's the whole issue. We've had that debate before, democracy versus development. Do you have a strong person who delivers development, and never mind if there are not elections, I've got enough food, I've got my kids in school, etc., etc.
Well, again, that's one of the things that, one of the arguments Afrobarometer data thoroughly debunks. What it debunks is when Africans say, we prefer a government that is more accountable to us, even if it is spotty in the area of delivery. They are saying a lot, and they are making a vote for democracy, including elections.
Do you agree with that, Yvonne? I mean, if you're elected freely, fairly, with integrity and so on, and you think you can just rest on your laurels and not necessarily deliver, would that work for you?
Well, I think we've got evidence. What's going on in Kenya right now is all about delivery. What went on in Mali was all about delivery. The reaction of Africans right across the continent confirms the fact that having food on your table, having hope for the future for your children matters. And having a government that can deliver on those aspirations is critical. Now, the challenge, I think, even in terms of what the data is saying, also comes back to this point of, is an election really an election? If there isn't that level playing field, So as Justice was saying just now, where you have constitutional interpretations, which allow systems to be changed, which allow electoral systems to be changed, you know, very close to the election. Basically, when the election goes through the process of being an election, but that level of integrity is missing. So you have a democratic election, but if there isn't delivery, there's a drive and a desire to have that changed, but you then have the question of, is the judiciary going to help you do that? Are you going to go back to an election where it's going to be the same again? So I think Africans, even in answering the question, it's hard for you to necessarily read that answer as homogeneous for everybody, because what happens as an election in one country is not necessarily what happens as an election in another. So what passes as an election? So maybe we need to stand back and maybe even begin to analyze, when you're looking at the country and you're asking that question, what is the experience of elections in that country? What does democracy actually mean in that context? And maybe look at the answers through more of a nuanced lens than just taking that question, applying it to all countries, reading all the answers as being the same.
So the answers don't give you the full picture, is what you're saying?
Potentially not, because of the differences that actually exist within all countries.
Rukeya or Jima, you wanted to disagree?
Actually, we do. And again, it will be rewarding to read the full report. It's got a lot of details in it that cannot be adequately explained in a short panel discussion. Yeah, but sure. Truly, the findings do confirm that Africans do value, so certainly they want to see social and economic performance on the part of their government. But they are even more exercised, they are even more upset by government misconduct and performance in the political realm.
All right. Rukeya, yeah, hold the microphone closer to yourself next time, Jima.
Thanks.
Yeah.
I think, it boils down to, this thought has been for some time, de-intellectualizing democracy, because very often we have a tendency that it's very much in the circle of experts or people who practice democracy, scholars, etc. So when you bring it down to the people, and that's why, Afrobarometer's data is so important in terms of the voice of people and giving a voice to the people. But I think, we need to really disaggregate what really is democracy, what really does an election mean. Because very often people sort of tantamount an election to being tick in the box, maybe in certain countries 1, in certain other countries 3 boxes. So I think we need to really have this understanding of the meaning of the ballot. And there's been a lot of discussion about, how do we make it relevant to people's aspiration, and especially when we're talking about voter apathy, and this idea that we are a little bit critical about supporting democracy. We are resilient about supporting democracy, the idea of democracy, but not satisfied. So I think this gap can be addressed by trying to really sort of, use data, use facts, use mechanisms of pedagogy, of learning, to get people to be part of more of this participatory democracy project, because very often you're on the fringes of decision making, and very often people have a tendency or consulted on the eve of elections. Yeah. And the type of consultation that they have is a very populist type of approach. What's in for me? I'm going to get something out of that. My family is going to get something out of that. I'm going to get some money out of that, but not really this transformational approach. And I think for some time we've been talking about this pitch between transactional leadership. So those leaders have been just transactional as opposed to real transformational. And that brings us into the conversation about the real renewal of politics in not only in our continent, not only in our societies, but globally. So I think, the pedagogy of democracy needs to be addressed so that, the average citizen understands what can I do in this in this transformation, that I bring the change
Which
as well.
is an important role for civil society and civic society organizations and so on. Do you want to come in on this, Chifundo?
Yes, I think just to pick on what Aruki has said about transactional versus transformational democracy, I think for me the data that says that Africans believe it is more important for a government to be accountable to the people than to get things done speaks to the notion that democratic governance is about the governors recognizing the governed as the real source of governing authority. So you don't account to somebody you recognize as having authority over you. So it's not just that you've done this for me, but in trying to do that for me, did you consult me? And how have you done it? Have you done it in an integrity, in a manner that shows integrity and the best use of the resources? So for me, there's a distinction between a very utilitarian approach to government. So government provides a service, I don't care how they do it. And in this democratic context, people are saying, if you're doing it in my name, have the humility to at least account to me. Engage me. I want to be part of the process. Because if you're giving me public services, but you're manipulating the procurement processes, I don't want to be party to that. I'm not sanctioning that. So for me, that data speaks to the depth of the culture of democracy getting inculcated in the population. People are recognizing that, yes, you may be the one driving the flashy car, but I am the Malawian. I hold the power of the vote. And just giving a simple comment, for example, in Malawi, because these elections, like we said in 2020, happened during the COVID public health emergency, the donor community and everybody told us, how can you do elections without observers? And we were like, well, the data on the ground says that unless we have a legitimate government in office, nothing will get done. So even though the previous government had many measures to combat COVID, because of lack of democratic legitimacy, nobody was allowing them to do even the right thing. And people were dying. When elections happened, the new government implemented everything exactly the same. Exactly. They didn't change a thing. But people were receptive because now they were confident in the government that was in place. So for me, it is about making sure that you have a truly integrated way to doing things. You're in government, but you're doing it for us. And people want to insist on that.
Right, great. Yeah, quickly on that, please, Yvonne.
Yeah, I just wanted to go back to the graph that Andrew showed right at the beginning of his presentation when he looked at the failure of growth in Africa over the last 60 years. And just remind us that, within the context of development, coming back to this point about transactional versus transformational, and to the point that the survey is making, that yes, indeed, you could be saying that there's a democratic process, but if it's not leading to growth, then and the other lines and the other sort of inferences that came from that was the role of corruption in that. So I think it comes back to this point, nothing for me without me. So if you're saying you're leading me, you're doing so democratically, but at the end of the day, you're doing it in a manner which is not allowing me to grow. And this notion that it doesn't matter if there's some progress, there's some GDP growth, but we saw that the levels of people's salaries, of people's incomes, are so much lower than what they were supposed to have been. So there definitely is a challenge in the way it's being done, and the way the accountability, the piece about accountability and allowing the citizens' rights to come forward, not just going through a process of democracy.
All right, there are a couple of other points I'd like to raise from the report, but since you mentioned corruption, I'd like you all to comment on it. And you very quickly first, Yvonne, because you're trying to reduce corruption in Freetown. So what are you doing and how much resistance have you met?
Well, I think there's the principal source of revenue for us as a city is property rates. And when I came into office, the property ledger, the property database was a ledger, it was a book, like literally a physical book, 37,000 properties. We introduced a system which digitized it, took a satellite image of the city, got rooftop measurements, went from 37,000 to 108, now 130,000. The resistance that led to was phenomenal, because now payments were not going to be made by cash, they had to be made through the bank. And I think that's just one example, but there are many other examples. Processes and systems, transparency and accountability. These are the way in which you are able to, overcome or lessen corruption. But I can tell you that I went through 7 investigations. I was taken to the Anti-Corruption Commission. I was taken to a special audit. Thankfully, none of those actions resulted in anything. But clearly, we have a fundamental problem. I just want to say one thing, because it troubles me so much. Right across the continent, I say to people at work, if you pretend to pay people, they will pretend to work. But where you have a system where everyone's salary is a pretense of a salary, no, the minimum wage will not buy you a bag of rice. How do you remove corruption? There needs to be a total shift. This is not incremental. There has to be a major shift in approach, because I've instituted salary rises, incentives, we're now working on a bonus scheme, but ultimately, I know that what most people earn is not a living wage. And until we address that from an institutional, governmental perspective, we're going to keep hitting our heads against a brick wall.
So it's remarkable how the report has shown how persistent corruption has been the biggest obstacle to democratic transformation and governance. Anybody want to venture a comment on, Ruqayyah? And just to remind you that this is being recorded, it's all on public record, just in case you do want to make that return journey to Mauritius.
Oh, well, anytime. No, I think basically when we talk about corruption, people are, it's just a small handful of people who are benefiting from corruption. And those, and this is a small, and a much more sort of elite, and we did some work some time back on the non-accountability of politics in Africa, and we looked at the case of Mauritius. And I think this increasing collusion between, power brokers and the business sector crowds out, the average person. So I think, how do we actually tackle? It's a tall order, but it's just about, commitment from those in power. And then, you might have, institutions that are created, but those institutions get very often captured in the hands of those who turn them into puppets. So I think we need to be serious about corruption. It's not impossible, but it's just about commitment, and actually brings you back to that leadership sort of set. But I think it's also about educating people that they should say no to corruption, because it's very often an easy sort of means to quickly get something out of it. So it can be something small, like paying your public official something to get a fast track. So I think this zero policy to corruption, and we've seen certain countries like Rwanda say no to corruption and be very systematic about it. But how do we actually tackle that issue is a tall order, and I bring it down to political leadership, really setting the tone and setting the way on that.
We can carry on hoping, can't we?
Yes.
Chifundo, I mean, the courts and the judges, the judiciary have a big role to play in accountability, and a lot of anti-corruption commissions do have a legal base, obviously. But your comments on corruption and why it's so difficult to eradicate.
I think around March I was invited to speak to our Bar Association as they were looking at the preparedness of the legal framework for elections next year. One of the things I highlighted in my presentation, which I think is sometimes ignored, is that the drivers of corruption in our economies are partly because government is the biggest consumer. It's the biggest, it does procure so many things, so many services. And so a seat in government gives you access to so many resources. And so the corruption begins at the campaign level. So political party financing and campaign financing are areas of keen interest for anybody who's earnest about dealing with corruption in the African context, in the public service. And sometimes I think there's a disconnect. People don't make that link. There's a reason why politicians are captive to business interests. Because when you fund me, I'll remember you tomorrow when I get to paradise. You know, and it works. And so it's a bit naive to talk about dealing with corruption when we focus only on the government side. There are many private actors, some local, some even global. I mean, there's enough research on this area about so many different players at the global level who actually provision in their books of accounts finances for paying bribes when they want to bid for certain services. So in my view, there needs to be that level of awareness about the drivers of corruption, and also a recognition that unless you get the right people in office to address this, you'll be talking about this until whenever. It's going to be a tough fight because corruption fights back. I haven't seen any country anywhere where a successful war against corruption has been waged without pushback. There's always going to be pushback, and you have to be fully aware of that and therefore build systems that can sustain the work beyond personalities. You need to create institutions that have got the robustness to push back and serve the interests of ordinary people.
You mentioned the drivers of corruption. Just very quickly, the ethnicization that Ruqayyah mentioned of many political systems in Africa. To what extent is that a major contributory factor to corruption?
So the ethnicity just happens to be an identifier of people with your common interests. So basically the reason I want my kinsman to work in the Electricity Supply Commission is I want, when I go and get a tender for the supply of certain things, he will say no, even if I'm not the best supplier. So the ethnicity card is played to draw loyalties from people who are going to serve your interests. But for me, the main issue is the money. People are following after resources, the public resources that are actually intended for the benefit of the ordinary man. And now where you have a government system that is working well, the majority of their resources should be invested in servicing the needs of the people. But where you have a compromised public service system, whether it is through ties of ethnicity or you have people who have gone to the same school, there are so many things that people use to identify each other. Those are the things that actually drive corruption. And I think the data exposes that in our African political context, ethnicity has been a card that has been used to undermine proper democratic integration. But I think the trends may be breaking up.
Okay. Professor Jima, you may wish to address something on corruption, but I also wanted to ask you, one very alarming statistic in your African Insights report is the fact that support for military intervention, or rather rejection of military intervention, has declined with substantial minorities and majorities even across, I think we said 39 countries, saying they would tolerate military intervention if it was to remove abusive civilian politicians. And we saw in Guinea how, you know, after Alpha Conde was removed, there was jubilation on the streets, and in Gabon with President Bongo and so on. So I wanted you to comment on what this tells us about democracy in Africa. But you may want to talk about corruption first, yeah.
On corruption first, but very quickly, that what, we are all concerned about the challenge. We all have a challenge about what to do about corruption. But we should also take into account an interesting piece of data from the Afrobarometer. Most Africans report that they are afraid of reporting corruption to the authorities for fear of suffering negative reprisals. So we should do something about the protection of people who go out of their way to report corruption. We must protect whistleblowers, and we must do all we can to make it easier for citizens to exercise their civic responsibility in this regard. That's all I would say about that for now. The military, the findings about the growing or the softening, the weakening levels of rejection of military rule is concerning enough. The new finding that a simple majority of Africans say they will welcome military intervention in situations where the incumbent government is abusing office, abusing power. That's also concerning. Even more concerning is the fact that the youth tend to be more, to express this sentiment of giving a welcome to military intervention far more than their adult, the older adults. That is all concerning. But I think there are drivers for this. There are drivers for this. We can't generalize generally because sometimes, as somebody has said on this platform, country conditions differ. I can almost explain why the military intervention in Guinea took place. It has something to do with the egregious violation of constitutional term limits by a president who had come to power on the back of opposition to perpetual incumbency. So under those circumstances, basically, you had a leader somehow hustled his way through elections, stolen his way to power through the ballot box, and who was killing and maiming citizens who were protesting a flawed and bogus election. Then the military intervenes, and there is popular support, and the youth are out there supporting this. But we should also note that there's a difference between military intervention and military rule. First, support for rejection of military rule still remains 66%. It's a large number on the average. We should also note that the youth tend to be less trustful. They tend to be more mistrustful of the military than the older adults. So they are also more likely to exhaust their welcome for the military rulers should the military rulers misperform, misconduct, misbehave, and so on. And then I take lessons from African history that the record of military regimes in office in Africa has been thoroughly sordid. And so there's no doubt in my mind that most of these regimes are going to fail because the military has not shown anywhere in Africa that it has the solution to development or to stability.
So you're saying it's folly for people to say, come out and intervene, because once the military come out of the barracks, it's very hard to get them back in again.
And it's lack of experience, and especially for Gen Zs, this is, they are born free. They have not experienced the horrors of military rule before.
Having been born in Sudan, where we see what's going on, which has had, I think, military rule for all but 10 years since its independence in '56. I wholeheartedly agree with that. We've run out of time. I just want you all very quickly, like in 1 minute, to say one conclusion from the African Insights report was that the gap between the democratic and accountability aspirations of the people of Africa and what their leaders actually provide them with is woefully still very large. So one parting thought on that, what can be done to try to narrow this gap? I'll start with you, Prof. Jima, and we'll just come along very quickly. Thank you.
Well, consistent with my pitch to address the democracy supply gap, you should improve your democratic performance. And I say that with seriousness because, you know, Africans and African governments don't have a whole lot of agency over some things. They can have agency over climate change. They can have agency over what to do when Islamic insurgents are bearing down on you. But they can have agency over whether they are corrupt or not corrupt, over whether they display impunity or they don't, or over whether they govern their countries well or not.
Okay,
so
thank you.
I put emphasis on better political performance.
Okay. Yvonne Akisoya, Mayor of Freetown, Sierra Leone. Just briefly.
So I think I would look back at my experience of running the city council in a manner in which the focus has been on development. So first term, transform Freetown, this time Transform Freetown, Transforming Lives, putting a high premium on accountability, engaging citizens, engaging residents, getting their feedback, and seeing that the impact of development has led to us having more votes in our second term than in our first term. But also really driving an agenda where for everybody in the city hall, and I think it's actually resonating because that point that was made about, you know, the politicians, and that's a generic statement, by the way, the politicians, that the relationship is always about, you're going to get something when I come into office. When I come into office, what you're going to get is jobs, not a handout, not a contract. And having that sort of change in mentality is something which I believe is possible, we're seeing more of, and we should continue to encourage and support it, even in the face of obstacles.
Thank you. Ruqayyah Kassanelli, Chairperson of the Electoral Institute of Sustainable Democracy in Africa.
You got it right. Thank you. I think, you know, it would be very interesting to actually use the data from Afrobarometer to bring it down to the people. I know it's a people's voice, but very often, you know, we need to sort of use it as an agency tool to bring about that transformational change. Because I think when people start to connect the dots, as you know, we mentioned earlier, the dots get connected and the picture seems more focused, and people start to realize, yeah, that's what's happening. And once they start realizing that the data is speaking to that, and that's their own voices that is being translated, I think that change will happen. So I'm talking about, you know, using it really as an agency tool, as a pedagogical tool, because I emphasize a lot on the pedagogy of democracy and transformation. And once that's done, people will start to, we talk about this trickling down effect, and it will take its time, but over time, you know, there will be this real understanding that change happens through the people. And I think that's the most really rewarding situation. And I think we don't depend on politicians, although, as Yvonne said, not all politicians are the same. We depend on the people, and I think it's what the essence of democracy is all about.
Okay, thank you. Justice Chifundo Kachali, former chair of the Malawian Electoral Commission, your final words.
Thank you so much. I think, building on the theme of agency that the professor alluded to me, what the data from these 9 rounds of surveys by Afrobarometer demonstrates is that, contrary to what others may have said before, the African polity is not an indifferent polity. They are quite responsive to their experiences. When experiences are positive, they'll give positive responses. When they are going through not so constructive experiences, then they will have their views informed by their experience. So for me, just for example, to pick the issue of the youth who are thinking that military intervention is a good solution to democratic failures, what to me would inform, if I was still sitting in my office as chairperson of Electoral Commission, would now to fashion targeted education, civic education programs to actually remove that misconception, because that is wrong. It is wrong to assume that the military can solve your democratic deficiencies, but that gap comes from the lack of information. So proper agency cannot be exercised democratically without accurate data. You need accurate data to inform the agent so that they exercise their democratic choices in a responsible and responsive manner. And where there are gaps in information, which is what this data is demonstrating, everybody has a role to play. And for me, I think there can be an overemphasis on the elections. Elections happen sometimes once in 5 years, once in 4 years. There are other actors in the civic architecture who equally have a responsibility to ensure that they create the kind of democratic agents who will build democracies that work for everybody in Africa. Thank you.
Thank you so much indeed to my panel. I think all I would say is you take the short-term view. I think, you know, we know there's a lot to be done, but I am convinced that, certainly if I'm still here, when Afrobarometer is celebrating its 50th anniversary, that we will be having a discussion of a very different, upbeat, positive and optimistic nature about Africa. Of that I'm sure. Thank you all so much for your attention. I think we stay for a photo op. I believe there's a photo op. Is that right, Joe? Thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you, Ruqayyah.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, Roger. Thank you. Thank you. I think we stay on stage, do we, for the photo op?
Yes, I think we stay on stage for the photo. But just before we get the photos, I know that we have our Chief Operating Officer just to tell us a few things as we depart here, and we'll stay here for a photo. Josephine, photo? The time for photo?
Are we having Andrew and
Yes.
Boniface coming up?
Shall we stand? I think we're being joined by them. I guess we stand.
And isn't there the launch of the report?
Yes, so it is the unveiling of the report. Okay, so I'll give it.
Oh, yes. It's all right.
Okay. So it's time to unveil the reports, and we'd like to call on our co-founder and board member, Professor Michael Bratton, and another member of our board, Amina Oyagula, to do us.
Thank you, Josephine. I'm not quite sure what you want us to do. Thank you, Zainab. If I may, let me just say I thought that was an excellent discussion, and I particularly liked the way it ended up. Afrobarometer provides data that is useful for academics. It may, in some cases, in many cases, be useful for policy actors. But what I think we need to push is the use of Afrobarometer data in civic education, so that people can be enabled and empowered to take their full role in these new democracies.
Absolutely.
Yes, Eric, would you like to say a few words?
Okay, so we're going to now, we've been charged to formally launch the, Joe, you should be here. We should be in charge to formally launch the flagship report, which is the inaugural flagship report. Very beautifully done. Joe, you should have a copy in your hand. So this is what we're going to do. I think we should stand on the stage with them. Yeah. Can you? Yes. Or maybe stand behind? No. Come here. So, Joe, shouldn't I give you the mic to do the formal launching? Because you've done all the hard work. I think you should formally launch it. We're just here really to support this fantastic effort. And I really hope that if you haven't already used the QR code to access, this beautiful report, please do so. If you care about Africa and its development and the future, well, I think this is something that we can all engage with, as Mike just said, in terms of educating, doing the civic education, ensuring that we get a copy of this report into the hands of all policy actors, not just on the African continent, but globally, because we are a global village and we are interconnected and integrated. And I think that this is really a fantastic piece of work which will be useful to absolutely everyone, both in public sector and in the private sector. So I'm now going to formally hand over the mic to Joe to do the formal launch.
Well, when your boss asks you to do it, you have to do it without questions. So I am standing on behalf of the Board of Directors of Afrobarometer, the International Advisory Council, as well as staff and management of our partners around the continent to officially unveil the 2024 Africa Insights Report, the maiden report for Afrobarometer. So there you go. Thank you. All right, so we are concluding now, and then I'll call on our Chief Operating Officer to just tell us the next steps, and we'll take a photo outside, and that will be it. We'll move on to line. So, Felix.
Yeah, thank you very much. That was exciting. The main message is to use a QR code to access the report and download it and read it. In terms of next steps for our anniversary celebrations, all our partners across the continent at the national partner level are going to be engaging country-level stakeholders to share the report and disseminate, engage, so that the policy actors and civil society, the media within the various countries will use the findings to affect policies in the countries. Our core partners at the regional level are also going to be doing activities at the regional level and collaborating with the African Union institutions within the various regions to again, do activities in this regard. At the global level, there are going to be launches in Washington, D.C. There's another build for sometime in October in the UK and also in continental Europe, where the report's going to be launched and the global stakeholders are going to be made aware of them. Secondly, we are continuing with our fundraising drive. As Joe mentioned, we want to Africanize the fundraising for Afrobarometer. This is a continental project. Currently, our funding is coming majorly from outside the continent, and so we would want to have as many Africans support our work. There's the common phrase we've been using lately, that if we had 1 million Africans giving us $10 each a year, we will cover more than 80% of our budget. So we are encouraging everyone to donate. We are partnering with Africa Giving. So if you go to their website, they are driving fundraising for Afrobarometer. They've made it easy. We also have Myriad USA that has a platform for donations for towards Afrobarometer. If you click on the Friends of Afrobarometer link, you will be able to donate, quite easily without any hindrances. If you have a debit card, in certain cases, you can actually use mobile money to donate. So these are the major announcements. Thank you very much. There is photo opportunity out there, so I think all right, thank you.
So just the final activity, I'm going to hand it over to the board chair to introduce the board members of Afrobarometer and then ODIPAT. So Prof. Jima to introduce both the existing board members, and we had 3 new board members who joined us yesterday. So, Jima.
Great. Since I have my own chair, I'm not going to go through the trouble of going up there. But it's my distinct pleasure and honor to introduce the members of the governing board of the Afrobarometer to you all this afternoon. I start with Professor Michael Bratton. Mike Bratton is a retired University Distinguished Professor of Political Science and African Studies at Michigan State University until 2018. He worked until 2018. He worked with the Afrobarometer and was also co-founder of the Afrobarometer and former executive director of the Afrobarometer and then senior advisor. We have next Amal Mustafa Medani. Amal is a development practitioner with more than 25 years of experience. As a strategic planning, operational, and senior policy advisor, she has led complex programs that span Southern and Eastern Africa, the Middle East, North Africa, Eastern Europe, as well as global level programs and policies. Next is Amina Oyagola. Amina is an independent director, a business leader, and a former human resources and corporate services executive at MTN Nigeria Communications Limited. With more than 30 years experience, her career spans legal consulting, banking and finance, energy, and telecommunications. That's also to say she is a senior advocate of Nigeria. Next is Lara Taylor Pierce. Lara is Auditor General of Sierra Leone and has more than 27 years of experience in public and private sector financial and administrative management and oversight. Next is Peter Lewis. Peter Lewis is the Warren Weinstein Associate Professor at African Studies at the Johns Hopkins University School of Advanced International Studies, SAIS. Peter Lewis has served as SAIS Director, as SAIS Associate Dean for Academic and Faculty Affairs from 2015 to 2018, and he has directed the school's Africa Studies program since joining Johns Hopkins in 2006, and currently oversees the school's Middle East program. Next is a distinguished board member who is not physically present here with us today for unavoidable reasons. Ambassador Nozipo January Bardell is the chairperson of the Council of the Nelson Mandela University and the United Nations Global Compact Local Network in South Africa. She is also an independent non-executive director of Mercedes-Benz South Africa, the MTN Foundation, and two NGOs, Sharawang, I'm sure I have butchered this, but you should all pardon me. Sharawanan Legal Services for Women who are victims of gender-based violence, and Penduka Literacy for undereducated primary school pupils in Alexander Township. We have been extremely fortunate to have been able to add to our board member numbers. The new members are Fauzia Ali. Yeah. Sorry. She's the Chief Consumer Business Officer at a leading telecommunications company in Kenya, East Africa. Again, for unpreventable reasons, she's unable to be with us physically today. Next is Kamisa Kamara. Ambassador Kamisa Kamara serves as a professor of practice in international diplomacy at the Gerald Ford School of Public Policy, University of Michigan. Parallel to this, she contributes her expertise as a senior advisor at the United States Institute of Peace and as a non-resident scholar at the Middle East Institute. Next is Natasha Kimani. Natasha is an advocate of the Kenyan High Court with over 15 years of work experience and expertise in developing and managing programs in gender mainstreaming, social justice research and activism, gender-based violence prevention and response and protection. And finally, Nick Cheeseman. Nick Cheeseman is a professor of democracy at the University of Birmingham and former director of the African Studies Center at the University of Oxford. He mainly works on democracy, elections, and development, including topics ranging from election rigging, political campaigning, and corruption to fake news and presidential rule. Distinguished ladies and gentlemen, this is our super sterling governing board. Please, let us CEO join us so that the whole governing team of the Afrobarometer is fully represented. And Joe doesn't need anybody's introduction at this point. All right, so I think it's now break for lunchtime, and Josephine, unless there's any other announcement, it's break for lunchtime, and we'll have the photo outside, right? I hope that's right. That's it? All right. So thank you all so much for making it. We're really grateful that you've been here. Tomorrow we'll be launching our Africa Judicial Independence Fund, also in this room, starting at 9 a.m. So for those who are with us for that, we will look forward to seeing you here then. Otherwise, in the evening, we will have our dinner reception. It will take place in this room. So at 6 o'clock, please, let's get back here, and we'll celebrate the night and climax this particular event, and tomorrow we'll continue with the celebration. So you're all welcome. Thank you so much, and we will step out for a photo opportunity.